This is BIOS security in track 6 with John Butterworth, Corey Hallenberg, and Zeno Kovac. This is a real full talk, so there won't be too much Q&A. There will be a little bit in the hallway afterwards.
All right, hello, I'm Zeno Kova. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves once they start talking. So we're going to be talking about BIOS security and in particular a defensive system that we developed that we call BIOS Chronomancy. We're trusted computing researchers at the MITRE Corporation, and MITRE is a not-for-profit company that runs 6 federally funded research and development centers for the US government. And a little more about MITRE is we've been around for quite a while, since the 50s when we spun off from MIT Lincoln Labs. And at the time, you know, we aren't military, we aren't government, we aren't educational, we're not an ISP. So actually the .org was made specifically to accommodate our sort of miscellaneous on the ARPANET. And if you know of MITRE, the primary place you'd know of it is from CVE. So we manage CVE as well as a number of other standards. And KPEC people asked me to promote that. So KPEC is Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Characterization. And it's basically a standard way to identify the way that people actually do attacks. So you should check that out. So first of all, why do we think people should care about BIOS security in general? Well, it's the first code that runs on a PC, and therefore it has to be the most trusted code, because if an attacker gets in and has code execution from the very beginning, then they can compromise any code that runs thereafter. So just as we see with bootkits, they run before an operating system and they compromise an operating system. If you run in the BIOS, you can compromise everything that comes afterwards. Additionally, there's, you know, BIOS is kind of out of sight, out of mind right now. And so no one is pervasively checking their BIOS and integrity checking whether anyone's actually infected it. And if someone were to infect your BIOS, they can sit there for a long time, and we're not so much concerned about them, you know, just going lower and then beaconing out with normal command and control like you see with normal OS level malware. We're more concerned about the fact that they could get into the BIOS, sit there, listen, and for instance, wait for a kill command and wipe the BIOS, and subsequently that's the kind of attack where you can't remediate that without sending hardware back to the manufacturers to reflash the spy flash. So also, you know, why should you care about BIOS security? It's just cool because it's, you know, not well known, and it's very powerful, and we think more people should know about it. So we specifically got interested in biosecurity partially because of, you know, the talks circa 2008, 2009 at BlackHat, and we sort of worked our way towards this. We were working on other kernel stuff at the time. But as trust computing researchers, we wanted to understand exactly how the technology worked down at the BIOS level. So in the trust computing specifications, they say things like, you know, we've got this immutable root of trust down at the lowest level, and that starts off all the measurements, and then each phase measures and goes to the next phase. But we wanted to know, how does that actually work? And so we dug into that. And obviously we wanted to know if an attacker could subvert this, and it turns out that that's true. So subsequently we utilized some of our existing work that's adapted from academic work, and we think that this builds basically a better measurement system down at the BIOS level, and that's the BIOS Chronomancy stuff that we'll talk about at the end. So basically the high level overview is we're going to say, you know, the attacker can get into the BIOS. You know, how could they get in? It could either be through misconfiguration or through exploits. You know, how does this trusted computing technology actually work down at the BIOS level? How can an attacker attack it? How can they subvert it? How can they make you think that everything's still working exactly the way it should when it's not actually? And then we'll talk about our defensive system. But so before we get into that, I wanted to introduce Rick Martinez from Dell. And so we wanted to have him come up and talk a little bit about what Dell's been doing for biosecurity, because our work is specifically looking at Dell Latitude E6400. And so a couple of years ago I saw Dylan Bresford's talk about SCADA security, and you know, he found attacks in Siemens SCADA systems, but he allowed the Siemens people to come up, provide themselves as a point of contact so that other researchers who are working in the area can know exactly who they need to go to if they want to talk about problems. So Rick's been great to work with, and so we wanted to let him say a few words.
Thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Rick Martinez, as Zeno had mentioned. I'm the biosecurity architect for the End User Computing Solutions group at Dell. I've been doing BIOS for over 13 years now, and I've done a lot of lead security work for the BIOS, and I've recently, past few years, transitioned more into an architecture role where I'm handling the architecture and strategy for security technologies that impact the BIOS. I want to thank Zeno, John, and Corey for letting me assist in their research and letting me say a few words today. They've been great to work with, and I look forward to working with them again. So I've got my contact information on the slides. What would possess me to put my contact information in front of a BlackHat audience? It's because I'm interested and I'm serious about biosecurity, and I'm serious about improving that security. Dell's interested in security. You've seen it from our acquisitions in the marketplace. We take a layered approach to security from the infrastructure to the endpoint to the OS, but you can't have a layered take on security without a very strong foundation, and that's the BIOS. So I'm interested in and very serious about improving the security of our BIOS foundation for the rest of our security stack.
Get it.
So again, sorry, my contact information is on there. If you're doing any kind of BIOS research or anything with Dell platforms in general, please feel free to reach out to me. Let's work together to kind of harden that security. We've also got an external incident response team and process that we're getting ready to roll out, and we'll have a public email address that they can use as well if you don't want to contact me directly. So with that, let's enough about me. Let's talk about the platform that we're going to be discussing today. So the Dell Latitude E6400 is one of our older commercial platforms, a notebook system. It was launched in August of 2008, about 5 years ago now. And it was built upon the legacy BIOS. And if you're not familiar with legacy BIOS, it's a precursor to the modern UEFI BIOS that you may be familiar with. It was written entirely in x86 assembly language. And the TPM or TCG implementation that's on that BIOS was implemented specifically for BitLocker and for BitLocker compliance. So it was a little bit of a different security landscape back then, and it was actually the last generation of legacy BIOS on our Latitude systems. I don't want to steal the researchers' thunder too much, but we do have a new BIOS available as of the 16th of July. It's revision 834 for the E6400. So after you hear their great presentation, please be sure, if you have an E6400, to go download that and update your BIOS. Just real quick, I want to end with this, and like I said, the E6400 was built on the legacy BIOS framework, specifically for Vista BitLocker. Since then, a lot of great technologies have come across for BIOS, and we've implemented them, starting with the UEFI transition, the NIST 800-147 BIOS protections that have been implemented, and most recently Secure Boot. You might have heard of some of those during Yuri's presentation earlier this morning. So that's all I have. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Rick. Yep, so we did this work on the E6400 basically because it was a target of opportunity. We had debugging hardware which would fit this, and we happen to be using E6400s internally at MITRE. So part of the point here is, legacy systems tend to stick around for a while, so the types of problems that we find here are, potentially found on other machines. And even if you have old machines, if your organization doesn't do BIOS updates, you're going to be sitting around with vulnerable BIOSes scattered throughout your environment. And how many backdoors and BIOSes does it take for the attacker to maintain a persistent hold on your network for years or decades potentially? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey, and he's going to talk about how an attacker potentially gets into the BIOS.
Okay, thank you. So this is all assuming that the attacker can actually get into the BIOS. And there are actually some chipset mechanisms that prevent an attacker from just writing directly to the SPI flash that contains the BIOS. Yuri mentioned this as well. But on a lot of modern systems, these are locked down, so you can't just do this sort of thing where you can just write directly to the flash and corrupt the BIOS. So what we found at the E6400 was that their 829 BIOS revision, they weren't locking down the BIOS. This was a while ago. But when A30 came around, they were locking it down, and they supported signed BIOS enforcement so that you couldn't just overwrite the flash chip with anything that wasn't signed with a Dell private key. So that's good security. So we still, as an attacker, want to talk about how we can get an arbitrary image on the flash chip, even in the presence of the signed BIOS enforcement. And so essentially, what you have to do is exploit the BIOS update process to do something like that. Now, something similar to this has already happened. In 2009, Invisible Things Labs showed an exploit, memory corruption exploit against an Intel BIOS that allowed them to reflash with an arbitrary image despite this signed BIOS enforcement. And we found something similar that affected a number of Dell systems, including the E6400. Okay, so our attack surface here is the BIOS update process. We're going to try to corrupt it somehow. And before we can do this, we really need to understand the attack surface and understand the Dell BIOS update process. So for the E6400 at least, the way this breaks down is the BIOS update image is called, in Dell terminology, an HDR image. And what happens when you want to update your BIOS is that the operating system packetizes this HDR BIOS update image, which can be many megabytes in size, so it can be quite big. So to handle that, they'll split it up into smaller packets, and these kind of get written across the address space. And then a bit in CMOS is flipped that indicates, all right, there's a BIOS update pending. And then the system reboots, and whenever this reboot happens, the BIOS is checking, is the CMOS bit set? If so, go out and find the pending BIOS update and do the process. And this all happens in system management mode. Okay, so this is just a little visual depiction of what actually is happening. You have the operating system kernel driver taking this big HDR image and splitting it up into what's called RBU packets in the Dell terminology, and they're just split all across the address space, and they're encapsulated by some header information which says things like the sequence number, the size of the packet, etc. That just helps the update routine reassemble the BIOS update image from those individual packets. So you can see here, this is actually the what would happen after the reboot. The system management mode update routine is literally traversing through the entire RAM address space, looking for these RBU packets, and it identifies them by this special string $RPK on like page align boundaries that indicates that an RBU packet is there. And then as it finds them, it collects them and then combines them in this reconstitution area, where eventually the entire Dell BIOS update image is going to end up. And not until this occurs is the signature check happen on the BIOS update image. The reason is the RBU packets themselves, those RPK things, are not being signed because it's up to the operating system driver to split up the image, and maybe those will be different depending on the operating system resources. So those are completely unsigned. The attacker can control anything about the meta information in those. Only until that image is completely reconstructed can the signature check occurs. So anything that happens before that is fair game for trying to find a corruption vulnerability in. Okay, so just to reiterate, our goal as an attacker is obviously to reflash the BIOS with an arbitrary image. And to do that, we're going to try to find a memory corruption vulnerability in this reconstruction process that the BIOS update process uses. So more specifically, our attack surface is really those RBU packets I was just describing. And you can see here, this is actually provided by like a SM BIOS library for Linux, so you don't have to reverse this or anything. It's just freely available. And this is what encapsulates all those individual BIOS update image packets, and it contains stuff that you would pretty much expect, stuff like the current packet ID, the size of it, what the sequence number is, etc. Pretty generic stuff for this type of problem solving. So, as I mentioned before, this 33-byte structure is unsigned. Anything in here in the parsing of this is fair game for trying to find a vulnerability in. Oops. Okay, so getting into the nitty-gritty of how this update routine actually works, what you're looking at here is system management mode code for the E6400. And this is what happens when one of those RBU packets is located. As soon as it's located, it starts to parse the individual packet. So in this case, it's copying some of those structure members into a global SMM data area. So things it's interested in, like the set ID, the total number of packets, the size, the sequence number, etc. These are all just copied into this kind of SMM global data area, and they'll be used for later calculations. And what's important to take note of here is there's not a lot of sanity checking going on, at least at this stage. You can see it's just kind of copying it to this data area, and they'll be used later for various things. Okay, so one little corollary here that's worth mentioning is part of the Dell update process is actually in that reconstruction area I was referring to previously. It's going to fill with this GEOR string, GEOR, it's like an ASCII tag, and I'm not exactly sure why it's doing this. We just saw it, the code doing it. I think basically it's adding this tag to the reconstruction space to signify where these individual RBU packets are supposed to end up in the reconstitution area, just as a debugging thing. So when they were developing this reconstruction algorithm, they could go in and debug it or something like that. But anyway, this thing is going to come back to haunt us and make exploiting this pretty difficult. Okay, so getting to the actual vulnerability, just to cut to the chase, if you look down here at the second line, that rep move SD is an inline mem copy. So obviously we should be thinking like buffer overflow. And if you look at the size parameter, ECX, if you look closely, you can see that it's like, let me see if I can point that out. Yeah, the refresh rate's kind of bad, never mind. So that rep move SD at the bottom, that's inline mem copy. The size parameter is ECX, obviously, and if you follow the chain up, you can see it's derived from attacker data, that HDR size, which just comes directly from that RBU packet. Okay, so, the size parameter, mem copy, bad, buffer overflow, we're definitely in business. But the situation is actually quite a bit more interesting than that, which is why we're really going into depth about talking about this. So if you look closely at this hex raise output for this relevant code, you can see that the source, the destination, and the size are all influenced by attacker data. So normally where you only get the size parameter, we actually control or influence at least the size and the source and the destination, which makes things really pretty interesting. So exploitable memory corruption vulnerability in the update process. What's great about this is it's happening in system management mode, and in SMM there's no things like ASLR, stack canaries, blah blah blah. So you're really free to pursue any target with impunity. Nothing's going to stop you. And in fact, since you're in system management mode, which is like the super privileged x86 mode, you can literally overwrite anything and nothing's going to stop you. It's not like you can go off the end of the stack and generate an exception. You can write over code. It's not going to be a segmentation fault. You can do anything and everything. Okay, so those are the good things that are working for us as an attacker. Unfortunately, exploiting this turns out to be quite tricky. Number one, because to get to this vulnerable mem copy, you can see it's actually looking at the what effectively here is the destination for the copy underlined in red, and it's checking to make sure the destination points to this GEOR tag, which kind of makes sense based on my previous description. It's making sure that the destination for the mem copy was previously filled in with this debugging tag GEOR. So this is going to complicate things. In fact, there's a number of other constraints that make exploiting this sort of difficult. In general, the hardest part about this was the buffer where we're overflowing is considerably lower in memory than anything we want to overwrite, like many megabytes. So we're basically going to just trash a whole lot of the system RAM in an attempt to overwrite any function pointers. And so it's pretty tricky to corrupt that much data in the address space and not hang the system. And so that's kind of what we are working around. And we had to go in and find, like, we can overwrite this but not this, and it won't hang the system, et cetera, and just come up with a list of constraints of stuff we can touch without causing a system crash. Okay, and back to the source, the destination, and the size. These are basically how they're derived in that vulnerable mem copy. So what's important to note here is that they're all derived from the same attacker-controlled parameters. So this RBU packet structure is completely attacker-controlled. The attacker can set anything he wants to for those things. So notice if you want to change, or like the destination, source, and size all have the packet size parameter in there. So effectively what this means is if you want to change the source or the size, it's going to change all the other parameters as well. So it's a bit like you have a sliding window that you can corrupt, and that window is going to change based on any number one of the parameters. So the trick here is to figure out the parameters so that that window corrupts the function pointers we want but does not hang the system. And this has actually ended up being a pretty tricky problem. Okay, So I previously mentioned that the reconstruction area is filled with this GR debugging tag. Now this should occur naturally in the BIOS update process where this GR debugging string is written. Unfortunately, we kind of short circuit the update routine so that does not happen. So you can see, let me see, the total data size right here. Well, first of all, we need this if statement to return 1. If this does not execute and return 1, then we'll never get to that vulnerable mem copy that we're basically trying to exploit. Oops. So we need this to run, and notice that forces total data size to be less than 800,000, 8 megabytes. But we want to write more than that. So the way we kind of get around this is we set the total number of packets to 1. This is an attacker controlled parameter in that RBU packet. So total data size is 0. Good, this executes. But what's bad is it means this GR string basically does not end up being written the way we expect it to be written. And furthermore, we found that if we let this mem set, which just zeroes out that whole reconstruction area first run, that would cause big problems as well, just zeroing out a huge amount of the address space. So unfortunately, to make this to hit this exploitable condition the way we want, we're going to have to make it where the GR string does not occur there naturally. Okay, so that GR string has to be there. Just to reiterate again, it has to be there to hit that vulnerable mem copy. So what do we do? Well, after thinking for a while, we actually sort of fakely generate this GR string in the operating system. We wrote a Windows kernel driver that would basically write the GR string as high up in physical memory as it could. It would keep allocating higher and higher using allocate contiguous and as a Windows kernel function. Keep allocating as high as it possibly can. Keep writing the GR string so it's kind of like a GR spray or something like that of the address space. And then effectively we're abusing the same functionality that the BIOS update does, where if you set up the system RAM and do a soft reboot, that RAM will actually stay in place. It's not like it's zeroed out upon a system reset. If it's just a soft reboot, the address space will for the most part stay the same. It's the same thing that the BIOS update does. So we found that if we just spray the address space with GR and then reboot the system softly, we could actually have it where this would stay in place and we could meet this condition. Okay, so there were a number of other constraints that I was sort of alluding to, and effectively what we did was we just wrote something to brute force a possible RBU packet that would overwrite a function pointer that we care about. In this case, we just chose the return address for the BIOS update routine, and remember it's totally legit to go after this because there's no exploit mitigations in the system management mode. So overwrite that, don't crash the system, etc. And luckily we were able to solve, get a brute force at RBU packet configurations that will let us overwrite the return address and not crash the system, etc. And just to give a visual depiction of what's going on, you can see here that with it's a bit hard for you guys to see perhaps, but if you come back to this, you can see like for the RBU packet, the packet number is unusually high, 0x83F9, and the packet size is FFFFE. So these things normally you would not see during a regular BIOS update process. They're obviously unusual, large, and malicious or whatever. And with those, what happens is the reconstitution area for the BIOS update actually overlaps the system management mode RAM. So if we do this cleverly, we can make it where we overwrite the return address being used by the update routine and then gain control of the instruction pointer within the context of the BIOS update routine. And at this point, we are free to reflash the BIOS with whatever we want. It doesn't have to be signed by anything. Okay, do we have the YouTube mode?
Escape and then do it on the desktop.
Okay, so this is just a yeah, okay. So what I'm doing here is this is the E6400. I'm just going into the BIOS setup and showing you that in fact that signed BIOS enforcement is turned on. Yeah, so it might be a bit hard to read, but yeah, basically signed BIOS enforcement is turned on. We can't just reflash the BIOS with an arbitrary image. The SPI is locked and everything, so you can't do something similar to what Yuri was doing. You can't just write directly to the flash. This thing is locked down pretty good. And what we're doing now is booting into the operating system, and we're going to run our malicious kernel driver that's going to write one of these malicious RBU packets to the address space and then trigger the BIOS update process. That way we can try to exploit it and reflash the BIOS with an arbitrary image. And in Windows, this probably requires a kernel driver, but in Linux, you could actually do this just from userland from the root account. So it would be like a userland to SMM and BIOS privilege escalation. So from here, what I just did was ran the kernel driver. It set up the address space with that malicious BIOS update packet. It flipped the CMOS bit. Now we're rebooting. Hopefully we'll trigger the BIOS update process and then get control of VIP. So yeah, at this point the BIOS update process should be going, but clearly we had control of the instruction pointer. Basically that last screen, which went away kind of fast, was just showing this. So, we have control of the instruction pointer in the context of the BIOS update routine, and at this point you can literally overwrite the flash chip with whatever you want, and the flash chip contains like the management engine and all kinds of other good stuff, so you really have complete control of the system. The other important thing to take away is that BIOS is actually responsible for instantiating system management mode. So once you have control of the flash chip, you have complete control of SMM as well, and you'll be persistent in there. So this bug allows you to get control of the BIOS and system management mode for good. And then once you have control of BIOS and SMM, you can do really bad things, primarily because the whole root of trust in the system, things like what the TPM uses, is on this BIOS flash chip. So now John is going to talk about some of the really nasty malwares you can implement once you have complete control of the system like this.
Thank you, Corey. Hi, I'm John Butterworth, and I'm going to present to you an example of a worst case scenario where the attacker is able to exploit a vulnerability, like the one that Corey just showed you, and install a permanent rootkit, persistent rootkit into your firmware BIOS. Now technically, modifying the BIOS with something like, say, a rootkit should be detected. In their PC client specification, the Trusted Computing Group does lay out a set of critical boot time components which must be measured in order to establish a trusted system. Now, the measurement of these components is referred to as the static root of trust for measurement, static being because you're assumed to be measuring the same thing each time. Each component is measured prior to control actually being handed off to that separate component, thus establishing a chain of trust, if you will. Now, for this discussion, we're focused specifically on that first initial measurement, which is referred to as the core root of trust for measurement, the responsibility of which is to measure itself as well as the BIOS. And because of that, it forms a sort of anchor in this chain of trust, as you will, and because it's also measuring the BIOS, therefore, technically, a firmware rootkit should be detected. However, as I'm going to show you, that's not necessarily the case. First, a little bit of terminology. We have the Trusted Platform Module, the TPM chip. It's located on the motherboard, has multiple security features. The most pertinent to this discussion is the fact that it is able to provide a signed quote of its current PCR set. It can also provide signed tick stamps, but Zeno will get into that a little bit later. Now, these PCRs, they are registers located on the TPM chips. They store 20-byte hashes. Each of these hashes represents one of these measurements of these critical boot time components defined by the TCG. The PCRs are reset to 0 upon reboot, and they can only be modified via an extend function, which is the SHA-1 hash of the current PCR value concatenated with the hash of the measurement that you wish to extend onto. Now, this is an example of a measured boot as defined by the Trusted Computing Group. Here we have our core root of trust for measurement, measuring itself as well as the BIOS and extending that measurement onto PCR 0. Now, as I stated earlier, the CRTM is the only measurement which we are focused on. I'm just going to leave these here for reference as they are beyond the scope of this discussion. This slide is just to show how our work in the trusted computing space differs from that performed in the past. Past researchers have actually attacked the TPM chip, like say with an electron microscope, trying to dig the keys out of, like say, the shielded locations that are located on the TPM chip. We are actually focused specifically on investigating the vendor implementations of these static root of trust measurements. Now let's just talk about the architecture a little bit. This is an image of the Q45 Express chipset on the E6400. We have here, it consists of a CPU, memory controller hub controlling I/O to system RAM, and we have an I/O controller hub controlling I/O to various system devices like, say, the SPI flash, which is where the BIOS resides, as well as the TPM chip too. So we're just going to simplify this into a simplified representation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the boot process now. When you power up your system, the CPU begins executing directly from the NVRAM flash, directly from the boot block, performing various generic chipset configurations. Specific to the Dell E6400, it begins to process a number of modules. Some of these modules are very benign, containing data such as the splash screen, which you see upon system boot. Others contain very important executable code like that code which will instantiate system management mode and its executable system management RAM space. And of course, the CRTM is another one of these modules, which will execute and extend its measurement onto TPM's PCR 0. Specifically what that is measuring, I will detail shortly. But first, I'd like to just outline some very general problems with relying on PCRs as indicators of a trusted system. For example, there are no golden PCRs provided by the OEMs. It is up to you, the truster, the owner of the system, to determine that these initial PCR sets that you see are in fact to be trusted. So you have to provide your own golden value, so to speak. There is also no description of what's actually being measured to incorporate, to create these measurements that you read in the PCRs. In our research, we were surprised to see that homogeneous systems, systems being the same hardware configuration, same model, same BIOS revision, would actually produce different PCR values. As well as we were also surprised to see duplicative PCR values when we were dumping the PCR sets. As you can see here in the figure below, indexes 1, 2, and 3 all share the same hash. Now what this means is twofold. One, no new information is actually being measured and extended into those PCRs. And two, what's defined by the TC Trusted Computing Group as a critical boot component that should be measured is actually not being measured. Anecdotally speaking, this hash is actually the hash of an empty PCR value concatenated with the SHA-1 hash of 0. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what the E6400's core root of trust of measurement is actually measuring. This is indicated above in this diagram at the top. This is the BIOS, and those gray slices represent what this core root of trust is actually measuring. These gray slices consist of the first 64 bytes of each of those modules, which I had described earlier during the BIOS boot slides. And as you can see, the core root of trust for measurement actually also is not measuring itself. Now, it's easy to look at this and say, well, that's the problem right there. If they were only measuring the entire BIOS, well, that would fix the problem. That's actually really not the case, as I'll show you shortly. That is a red herring. The real problem is because the CRTM is actually something you can modify. It's mutable. So, but regardless of that, you still want to perform the measurements correctly. So there are some problems with weak measurements. For example, as shown on the previous slide, if you're not measuring certain components such as the PCI option ROMs and BIOS configuration, that is ungood. You're not actually capturing those measurements. It's also possible, judging from what's actually measured on the previous slide, that you can actually arbitrarily modify bits and pieces of the BIOS without actually triggering any changes in the PCR sets as well. Yuri actually presented a similar discovery at CanSec West 2013, where he found he was able to arbitrarily modify the BIOS on his ASUS motherboard without triggering any changes in his PCRs. The takeaway from this is that this is not limited to a single vendor. This is an industry-wide problem, we believe. As I stated earlier, regardless of how much of the BIOS is actually being measured, it is possible to still install a rootkit in there. So what if an attacker wanted to modify any part of the BIOS, regardless of whether or not they're measuring the entire thing? Well, you can forge the PCRs, and this works because the BIOS is mutable. This is basically your standard run-of-the-mill replay type of attack, where the attacker is able to either record or calculate the known good measurement that's performed by the CRTM to record that hash that gets passed to the TPM to extend onto a PCR0. It's then able to modify the CRTM to prevent that good CRTM from running, and then to replay its pre-recorded hash to the TPM to extend onto PCR0, thus reporting your golden value, so to speak, of PCR0 that you expect to see, even though the CRTM has actually been modified. And from there, the attacker is able to insert itself into system management RAM or any other part of the system that it wants to. So, as Corey hinted, here's an example of some really bad things that can happen when this is a possibility. Just to show that this isn't just paper analysis, we created 2 proof-of-concept firmware rootkits. Each is installed programmatically. There's no hardware modification required to do this. We created the tick and the flea. Both of these are persistent stealth malware. The tick achieves its stealth by forging PCRs. And of course, once it's achieved this stealth, it's free to modify any other portion of the BIOS that it wants to, including inserting itself into system management RAM. The flea has all those exact same basic stealth capabilities as the tick, but it's actually also able to persist even beyond BIOS reflashes. So as a recap, this is just an example of a normal PCR0 measurement where the CRTM executes, creates this measurement, and extends that measurement to PCR0. Now, if there's a tick installed, it of course prevents the good CRTM from executing, takes its pre-recorded hash value, and extends that to PCR0, thus producing the exact same PCR0 value as you would expect from a healthy system, when clearly there is something else in your firmware. So now we have a quick little demonstration to show the stealth capabilities of the tick. So what we have here is a BIOS revision A29. Which just booted up. You just saw the Dell splash screen. For this presentation purposes, that splash screen is actually going to be the only trustworthy indicator that this system is actually something that can be trusted. And just as a little spoiler alert, you're not going to see that again. So this is our setup. In the upper right hand corner, we have a kernel debug output, which we're going to use to grab our PCR values using our open TPM driver, which Corey wrote, and I will provide a link to. It's open source. So what we're grabbing here, this is actually our known good. This will serve as our golden PCR0 value. This is an unmodified BIOS, which is just booted up, and we recorded that into a text file just so we can compare and contrast as we go through the boot process. So what we're installing here, just to show that the PCR values will change, this is a naive rootkit. Naive is a rootkit that we refer to as naive because it has no stealth capability. It can be easily detected simply by observing PCR0. So what we expect to see when we again run the open TPM driver and dump our PCR set and grab our value of PCR0 and compare it to our golden value, we expect that value to be different. So we're just going to get logged in here and perform that. Just pause here real quick so it doesn't go too quick, but indeed, this hash is different, and so this rootkit is easily detected simply by observing the PCR value. So now we're going to install our tick. Now remember, the tick has that stealth capability where it forges the PCRs via the replay attack. So we just executed that. We're going to go through the update process again. And what we expect to see is that in this case, the PCR 0 will actually match our first golden value of PCR 0. So it will appear that nothing in the BIOS has actually changed. However, something has changed. Again, the splash screen has changed. Just a benign change. So now we're just going to get logged in here and compare our values of PCR 0 to the initial value. We'll provide a link to the open TPM driver as well, in case anyone here wants to start dumping their PCR sets. And indeed, just pausing here real quick, this does actually match our golden value of the PCRs. So it appears that the BIOS is unmodified, when in fact it has been modified. Now we're going to talk about the flea. As I stated earlier, the flea has all the same stealth capabilities as the tick, performs the same replay attack, it forges PCR 0, thus remaining undetected. It's persistent not only between reboots, just like the tick, but it's also persistent beyond BIOS reflashes. So whereas I just showed you with the tick where you can't actually rely on the TPM to tell you that the system is clean, you also cannot necessarily rely on BIOS reflashes to tell you that to cleanse your system of a particularly nasty rootkit. So here's how the flea basically works. The flea has hooked the BIOS update process. So of course it's aware that it's about to begin. It clones itself into that BIOS firmware update that's in resident RAM. Once it's in there and all set, it simply permits the update process to continue. Thus the flea has persisted to your newly updated flash BIOS. And again, we're going to see a little video displaying this aspect of the flea. Okay, let me just start this one over. Okay, so what we're starting here, we're actually starting, in the interest of time, we're just starting here with a system that already has a flea installed on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through, we're going to perform a BIOS update and just show that the flea actually does persist. It would be redundant to show the forging capabilities. However, I should mention that once the flea persists and clones itself into the new BIOS update, it will actually forge the expected update for that BIOS revision. So what we're going to do is we're going to simply update our BIOS to BIOS revision A30 using Dell's utility, which you can download from their site. BIOS revision A30, at least at this time, offered some security updates. Of course, if you have an E6400, you should listen to Rick and install BIOS revision A34. We're going to go through the update process, and like I said, we expect to see that the flea has persisted into this new revision. And as you can see, the flea has persisted to BIOS revision A30. It's a little bit dim there at the bottom. So I'm going to pass it over to Zino Kova, who's going to tell us how to combat these firmware rootkits.
All All right, so what we did then is, we're defensive security researchers, and we had some previous work that we had done in Windows kernel, trying to get better roots of trust so that we can, basically we're worried about these sort of attacks, specifically where the software can lie and say that everything's good. So first of all, you should probably take down this bit.ly link at the bottom. There's about 10 years of work in the area that I'm going to describe, and I'm not able to do it justice in the small amount of time that we have left. So we put up a timeline there that talks about all the other work in this area. But what we did is we created a system we called BIOS Chronomancy. And what it is timing-based attestation or software-based attestation. That's the terminology in the academic community. And what this kind of software is trying to do is you're building software with a very special construction where you're trying to say, this software will tell me that it is uncompromised, and if someone has compromised and is making it lie, it'll take extra time to actually run. So you're trying to build it specifically so that if it's manipulated, if someone's trying to put a hook into it, but then they're cleaning up and making it look like it's not hooked, it's going to take additional time to run. And this is the sort of timing side channel that we're purposely building into the software's execution. So the BIOS Chronomancy system is, we're not trying to re-implement the entire static root of trust for measurement. We're not trying to measure the BIOS itself and then the option ROMs and then everything else. We're just saying we want this first root of trust. We've got this mutable BIOS, so we know an attacker can potentially get in here and modify it, and we want to have additional trust in this specific software. So again, there's a lot of different assumptions with this. You should see the previous related work and our future paper on this to get them all. But the first assumption, and we think this is what makes this technique in general so appealing, is you assume that the attacker has full control of the system before you execute, and even potentially while you're executing. They can do whatever they want before and during your execution, but the intention is you build your software specifically so that if they modify you while you're running, you run slower. And then another thing, a big assumption here, is that the code we've written is the most optimal way that we can check ourselves. So if an attacker can come in here and create a little better hand-coded assembly and make it run a little faster, he can add an instruction which would normally slow it down, but then he can combat that by optimizing some other instructions which speeds it back up, and then we don't detect any timing changes. And similarly, we have to make sure that deep down at the microarchitectural level, with all of the different ALUs and everything else that's available for the processor, we have to make sure there's no free slots where they can just add an instruction, and because there's an idle subcomponent of the CPU, they can't just use that for free. So all of this related work, fundamentally it breaks down to having these core premises. First of all, you're going to read your own code and your own data. So you're reading yourself in order to provide some evidence of control flow integrity or code integrity. So you want to make sure no one's put a jump instruction in your code to hook you like rootkits commonly do on OS level software. So you're reading your own code, you're building a checksum over your own code. And unlike things like a malware where it's just trivially that malware will checksum itself to look for an analyst putting a breakpoint in it, but we need to make sure that that if we do this sort of checksumming, that it's going to cause a difference in the timing execution, which subsequently gets measured. So then what we do is we read the data pointer, which is pointing at our own code and our own data. We incorporate that into the checksum. And the notion there is if the attacker takes our code and copies it off to a clean location, so they've got a clean copy of our code. When we try to read our own stuff, they point us at the clean copy. Well, we incorporate the pointer itself. So they're pointing at some other copy. They're not pointing back at our own thing, at our own location where we know it should be. They're pointing at a different copy, and so they need to modify the incorporation of the data pointer, which means they need to do, maybe an add and a subtract, for instance. And those two extra instructions are then going to perturb the timing. Similarly, instruction pointer. We're executing at a known location. We're reading data from a known location. If we incorporate those pointers and if the attacker is pointing them to different execution location, different data read location, then they have to fix that back up during the checksum computation, and that modifies it. Also, unlike this we don't want trivial replays, so there's not a fixed, here's our single checksum which proves that we're clean. We use a nonce in order to have freshness and make it so that you can't just keep replaying, yep, I'm clean, and just have a plain replay attack like that. It also helps prevent pre-computation attacks where the attacker stores every possible combination of challenge to response. So with a big enough nonce, they don't have enough RAM to keep it around. And then the important thing is all of this incorporation of data into your self-checksum, you do it millions of times so that you're trying to make it so that if they add even one instruction of overhead times millions of iterations, that means millions of instructions of overhead. So this is what it would kind of look like as C pseudocode. In reality, it's always hand-coded assembly because you have to have that optimality assumption. But the point is, we're incorporating some of these things, the nonce, the data pointer, the data pointed to by the data pointer, the instruction pointer, we're mixing it around, and then we're doing this all in a while loop. If the attacker knows that he's compromised your data, if he's modified your self-checking code and he wants to make it look like he hasn't, he needs to check. Is the good code about to read some bad data? And if so, I'm going to give it the good data. And that's basic if kind of conditional, but by adding an if conditional, that's a couple of instructions extra that he has to do to clean up this checksum and make sure the checksum is still correct, and a couple of instructions times millions of loops equals millions of instructions of overhead, millions of instructions equals macroscopic timing difference. So overall, this is what our protocol basically looks like. We're down at the BIOS level. Unlike some other things, we can't necessarily get a challenge from a server. So we're actually going to get our nonce from the TPM. We request from the TPM this special type of measurement called a tick stamp. And all it really is basically the TPM, when it resets, you have a counter counting up. It's a tick counter. It's just like RDTSC on x86, except the big thing that the TPM gives you is the TPM can give you a signed copy of that tick stamp so that you actually have some belief that this is actually coming from the TPM that you've provisioned and you have the keys for, and you can check the digital signatures and so forth. So it sends back the time stamp that's signed. It also has a nonce that's built into it. The TPM makes a new nonce every time the TPM resets. You take that, you incorporate the data from the signature, which is going to differ every time because of the different nonce the TPM generates. Use that as the nonce for the self-checking algorithm, and then you run your millions of iterations reading your own code. And subsequently, you then ask the TPM, what time is it now? So basically, we kind of think of this like a trusted stopwatch. You say, TPM, what time is it now? You run your self-check, which is specially designed so that it increases the amount of time if an attacker is manipulating it. And then you say, TPM, what time is it now? And you've got your time 1, you've got your time 2, so you've got the delta time, and subsequently you can use that. You say, here's a given CPU, here's it running at a certain clock speed, we know how much time this algorithm should take over this many iterations. So you just send back to a server to verify, here's the tick stamp 1, tick stamp 2, and the self-checksum, and it can confirm that. So we did a bunch of experiments on this, you can see our paper later for it, but the key point here is we took like 18 E6400s just to show that this works across many systems. It's not just a one-time deal that we got to work on ours. And the basic point here is without attacker, it's low, and with an attacker, it's high. But back here, the main point is if we don't run enough iterations, potentially we're on the boundary. So at 625,000 iterations, the attacker sometimes can get fast enough that his lower bound on his runtime is about the same as the upper bound on the clean runtime. But this is pretty easily dealt with because what you're really dealing with here is there's a percentage overhead that the attacker adds by adding a couple instructions as a couple percent overhead. So if you want a larger macroscopic difference for a small percentage overhead, you just run it more times and you get more difference. So, pretty clear in all these cases that we have easy detection of the attacker, that he's perturbing the timing. So we know that this system gives us, under the academic sense of it, it's a great thing because it's saying this code is unmodified. We can, verify this, and that's all good. But what we found when we dug into this is we said, well, that's good from the academic perspective, but in the practical perspective, we want to, stop attackers from being able to do bad things. And kind of a big problem with this kind of technique is a talk-to attack, time of check, time of use. So I check the system, and it says, yep, the checksum is right, the timing is right, this code ran unmodified, and that's great. That's a property which, quite frankly, we don't have for most any other security software out there. That's a good property, but it's not sufficient. It's necessary, but insufficient, as the academics say. the attacker can remove himself from the system, allow a measurement to proceed with a clean system, and then, reinstall himself after the checks. And so that's why, this is kind of future work that we're working on right now. We're branching out into the peripherals. We know that there's been plenty of work in the BlackHat community with, infecting NIC cards, infecting keyboard controllers, and so forth. So we're concerned about this kind of thing, and we're working on that because fundamentally we think that if you can't stomp out this kind of attack down at the BIOS level, it's not going to be useful at other higher levels. So the basic conclusions are, we think you should assume attackers can get in. We think that this sort of timing-based attestation system is built under that assumption, so that's a good thing. Corey showed ways that you can get in. Yuri showed ways that you can get in. The attacker gets in. We have to work under that assumption. And then obviously bad things can happen because unfortunately when we have these mutable roots of trust, that becomes untrustworthy once it's mutable and an attacker can get in. So one of the things I forgot to put on here, but it was in the sort of in the summary. So Rick mentioned how they started applying the NIST 800-147 guidance. That's saying, apply things like signed updates and so forth. And they did that. They locked down the flash chip. They applied signed updates, and that increases the security. So going beyond that, part of our point of showing the flea was to say signed updates is, again, necessary but not sufficient, because if an attacker is in there before the signed updates are applied, he can just keep bouncing his way across new signed updates being applied. And similarly, you can have signed updates, but an attacker can exploit and get their way in. So there's further NIST guidance. There's the NIST 800-155, which is targeted at vendors, basically saying, here's the type of stuff we think you need to actually measure in order to provide a good root of trust. And as trusted computing researchers, that's the kind of stuff we care about. But fundamentally, as we've mentioned a couple of times, the core problem here is that your core root of trust is mutable. And if it's mutable, then somehow, some way, we assume that the attacker is going to be able to get in and they can subvert your root of trust. All right, so the one last thing that we have to say, there was like a question in Yuri's talk about, what's the prevalence of BIOS misconfigurations. We've actually, that should be live now. And we released a tool called Copernicus. And what it does is it tells us about things like misconfigurations in the BIOS security. So if you've got a BIOS that's not locking down the flash chip, Copernicus will tell you that. It'll say BIOS, it gives us simple things like, is SMM writable? Is SMM locked or unlocked? Is BIOS locked or unlocked? And so we've released the binary so you can just go play with this and see on your own machine, are you vulnerable to a trivial wiping of your BIOS? Can it be trivially bricked? Also, we care about this for doing analysis of the systems. So Copernicus gives us a BIOS flash dump, and then from there you can, as we kind of talked about, there's problems with PCRs in that you get a hash, but then the question is, if you've got your nice trusted computing system and hashes differed, then what, right? What are you going to do if someone tells you the hash of your BIOS is not what it should be? So Copernicus gives you the ability to like dump the flash chip and go ahead and start looking at it. Look at a clean one, look at a dirty one, diff it, throw it into IDA, and that's exactly the kind of stuff we do. So, MITRE works for the government. So for anyone here who's a Fed, basically, we're interested in doing deployments, pilots within your environment so you can check, how many of your machines are actually vulnerable to trivial bricking, and also, pull back the BIOSes and say, we have, this is what we think the Dell golden image for a flash chip should look like on an E6400 or newer things. But if you don't have that, we'd like to, actually analyze that and find out why. Additionally, MITRE's a not-for-profit company. We don't make COTS software. We've found out the hard way, we don't like to run science projects for many years at a time. So kind of this capability needs to be incorporated into commercial products. And we're licensing this, and it's a very easy license because fundamentally we're going to be licensing it as data for code. So you give us data about how many machines you've seen vulnerable. We incorporate that into our next paper, which again, part of the reason for releasing the binary is we'd like people to go check your own machines and then tell us, I've got this model and it's vulnerable. So our next paper is going to be basically how prevalent is this in the wild? What percentage of machines are trivially writable? What percentage have TPMs? What percentage have them on? All this sort of things. Which vendors do better than other vendors? So if you care about this thing and you're doing purchasing, you want to know which ones are actually locked down. So we're looking to license this to COTS and do piloting in government in particular, but we're also open to doing it for just general people who are interested in finding out about their biosecurity, because it helps our ongoing research. So unfortunately, we jammed packed it with like 3 talks worth of material, so we don't have a lot of time for questions. I see people queuing up at the back, so we won't take them up here. We'll go right out there, and right to the right, there's a little area that you can ask us questions. But our 2 last things that we're going to pimp here is Corey's Open TPM. If you want to start playing with the TPM, he's provided open source tools that you can do that. And then finally, OpenSecurityTraining.info. We've got classes on TPM, so you can learn about it. We've got classes on IDA Pro and reverse engineering, so you can learn about that. And John's going to be making a class on BIOS, so you can learn more about that. So with that, thank you.